other book. I can keep it on top of that. Anyway, it's a fabulous introduction because it was short and it was not embarrassing for anyone. And it is fantastic that we have a person like Jairam Ramesh with us this evening. There are two things about Mr. Jairam Ramesh. One is that he's a fabulous raconteur. And next, he doesn't speak in the air. All is evidence-based. So whatever he says, you can be sure is backed by facts. So with these few words, because we got a long evening ahead of us and it has to conclude at 8:30, may I request you to give a small introduction to your book as you see it fit. Why did you write it?
Well, thanks, Uday, and I'm grateful that my guru in many matters, Ambassador Ranganathan, is also here. And he'll have much to say about this book because he figures in the book as well. Why Krishna-Menon is the question that has been hit at me from many quarters. And so let me begin by addressing this issue, why I wrote this book. This is the 7th biography of Krishna-Menon in the last 50 years. People have written on him, but all the previous books have been basically hagiographies. They've not been biographies. They've either been by his admirers, worse, they have been by his relatives. And the one thing relatives should never do is to write biographies of their grandfathers or their great-grandfathers, because they lose their objectivity. So, in the last 10 years, mountains of archival material were declassified. They were declassified in China, in Russia, in America, in England, in Canada, and most importantly, in India. Most recently, in February of this year, some 10,000 files which Krishna-Menon had left behind were finally opened for public scrutiny. So the first reason to write this book is that the amount of material, primary material that has become available on this man has never been available to previous biographers. Secondly, Krishna-Menon was a very consequential figure in Indian history, both pre-1947 and post-1947. We see him only through the lens of 1962. However, the story of Krishna-Menon is infinitely richer than being the villain of 1962. Today, every Indian has discovered the preamble to the Constitution, and the in thing to do now is to read the preamble in public. The first draft of the preamble was prepared by Krishna-Menon. The idea of a constituent assembly to prepare a constitution for a free India goes back to the early 30s. And the first person to canvass the idea for a constituent assembly was Krishna-Menon. It took him 7 years to it didn't take him long to convince Nehru, but it certainly took him 6 years, 7 years to convince Gandhi. And finally, the Constituent Assembly becomes a reality only in 1946. So the second reason is he's consequential as a freedom fighter, but a freedom fighter who didn't go to jail, who didn't sit on fast, who didn't wear Gandhi caps. He was a freedom fighter in London, kept the flag of Indian independence flying in London, and played a very important role in the transfer of power, in the partition of India, and we'll all come to that a little later. So he's consequential pre-1947, and in post-1947 period, of course, he is the second most well-known Indian figure in the world. The second most written about figure, the second most photographed figure, the second most lampooned figure, and he really, next to Nehru, is the most well-known Indian, both in India and abroad. The third reason for writing this book is that to understand 20th century India, you have to understand Nehru, and to understand Nehru, you have to understand Krishna-Menon. Because for 25 years, from 1935 to 1962, for 27 years really, Krishna-Menon was Nehru's soulmate. He was his ideological comrade, he was his friend, he was his confidant, he was a member of his family. Nehru's family was very small, and for 27 years, Nehru's immediate family consisted of his daughter and Krishna-Menon, frankly. And therefore, to understand the evolution of Nehru's own thinking vis-a-vis Indian politics and global politics, Krishna Menon plays a very important role. And that's why it's important to understand Krishna Menon. Finally, something that Ravi just mentioned right at the beginning. This is my own personal belief that we do not have a tradition of political biography writing in our country. There have been very few political biographers. Sarvepalli Gopal was the most distinguished biographer India has produced. He wrote 3 volumes on Nehru, and more importantly, he wrote a biography of his own father, which was extremely, extremely critical, leading, in fact, to a rupture in relations within his own family, as Ambassador Ranganathan may recall. Rajmohan Gandhi was a second great biographer. He wrote biographies of Gandhi, Patel, and Rajaji, which have not been equaled. Ram Guha, of course, I have to mention Ram Guha in Bangalore, and his biographies of Warrior Elvin and Gandhi. I believe, barring these 3, very few others can qualify to be political biographers. And the essential qualification for a political biographer is that he must deal with the written word. In India, we have 2 traditions. We have the tradition of Shruti, what we hear, or we have the tradition of Smriti, what we recall. We don't have the written tradition. The Ramayana, the Mahabharata, these are all oral for a long period of time before they actually got written down. And biographies in India are either Shruti or Smriti. Either people remember or people, what they have heard, they become biographies. And I believe that we must inculcate the art of political biographies, particularly based on the written word, based on archival evidence, most importantly, based on contemporary archival evidence. And that's what I've tried to do in this tome of a book. And it could have been bigger, actually, but with great difficulty, I kept it at 700 odd pages. But it's all, as Ravi mentioned, there's nothing in this book that is not backed by written evidence somewhere, in some archive or the other, either in India or in China or in Russia or in Canada or in the US. So that's, I think, what I have tried to do with the Krishna Menon biography. I did with the Huxer biography last year and the Indira Gandhi biography previous year, that we must get into the tradition of political biographies, particularly based on primary archival evidence. So, in short, Uday, he was a charismatic figure, he was a colorful figure, he was a very controversial figure, but he did much to shape the India of the 40s, the India of the 50s, and India of the 60s. Let me end by saying that, I don't like the word history. I don't describe this book as a work of history, because I believe the word history is a very dangerous word. I prefer to use the word itihas, because history translated in all Indian languages is itihas. And the literal translation of itihas is itihas. That's what it is. This is what it was. No judgments, no retrospective hindsight. This could have happened, he may have done this. This it was. So this book is not a book of history. This is a book of itihas. Thus it was. This is what happened in the 30s. This is what happened in the 40s. This is what happened in the 70s. The reader makes up his or her mind whether Krishna Menon is a good guy or a bad guy. I have not come to any conclusions. Even in 1962, of which Ambassador Ranganathan is a leading authority, I have not said at the end of the evidence whether he was a good guy or a bad guy. All I have said is itihas. This is what the evidence is as far as Krishna Menon's role is concerned. So let me stop here, and maybe you can subject me to some questions.
Before asking Ambassador Ranganathan to intervene into this, and wade into this rather, I got to ask you one big question which comes out because I reviewed the book. What is this extraordinary relationship you brought out between Nehru and Krishna Menon? I mean, it's something which defies imagination. It defies logic also at times. So I'd like to know from you.
Well, I must also say, I'm glad you asked me this question because the one thing that I have avoided in this book is psychohistory. You know, it's very easy to get into psychological explanations of why people behave the way they behave. And Krishna Menon is a fit subject for Freudian or a Jungian analysis. Deeply insecure, prone to suicides, constantly on medication, manic depressive, given to violent mood swings, would be called bipolar disorder. I mean, is fit case for psychological analysis. I have not done that. The only way to answer your question, Uday, is that it was Nehru met Krishna Menon for the first time in October 1935 in London. It was love at first sight. Intellectually, they clicked. Their friends were the same. They had the same male friends in England. More importantly, they had the same female friends in England. Their female circle was identical, Edwina Mountbatten and company. The male circle was Stafford Cripps, Clement Attlee, George Bernard Shaw, and so on. Both of them were democratic socialists. Both of them were deeply, deeply impressed with the Soviet Union and what the Soviet Union had accomplished, but were not enamored of the Soviet political model. They were enamored of the Soviet economic model. Both of them, unlike Gandhi and any other Congress leader barring Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, both of them saw the Indian freedom struggle in its global context. They saw India fighting Britain, they saw the Republicans fighting Franco, they saw China fighting Japan, they saw Emperor Haile Selassie fighting Mussolini, and they saw the British fighting the Nazis. So Indian freedom movement was part of a global movement against colonial imperial forces. Both of them loved books. Krishna Menon, to those of you who don't know, Krishna Menon was one of the 3 people who founded Penguin Books. He was the editor of Pelican Books. Many of you may have seen Pelican Books. During my childhood, this was the low-cost literature that used to be produced under the Pelican title. Krishna Menon was really the man who started Pelican Books. And he was a literary agent of Nehru. He published Nehru's autobiography and published subsequently all his other books. So it was an intellectual relationship. And Nehru gave him a long rope. I mean, that rope kept getting longer and longer and longer. And that rope would never have been cut, had China war not taken place and had, the Congress Party not told Nehru on the 7th of November 1962, either you resign or Krishna Menon goes. And Nehru, being the politician he was, decided that it's time for Krishna Menon to go. So it was an unusual relationship. Nehru found Krishna Menon cosmopolitan, non-parochial, intellectual, all that the Congress Party men were not. Most Congress people around Nehru, provincial, not well-read, deeply embedded in caste, or deeply embedded in religion, or deeply embedded in language. And here was Krishna Menon, not worried about caste, not worried about language, not worried about region, deeply cosmopolitan. And I think that's what made a very lonely Nehru make Krishna Menon his confidant.
In fact, that's what Galbraith also says during his tenure as an ambassador in India. Nehru sought him out for his intellectual companionship in this place. But going over to Ambassador Ranganathan, I have to. I mean, you have no choice about it. Now, could you, as a Foreign Service officer, you've known Krishna Menon. He has been part of your early years also in the service. What do you make of a man who was defense minister who was constantly dabbling in foreign policy? I mean, how I'm not dabbling, literally running foreign policy, I must say.
It's a great honor for me, really, to be sitting in this podium. And Jairam Ramesh has been a friend of a for many, many years, almost 30 or 40 years. But I should have been more wary before accepting this invitation, because I was almost certain that Jairam would put me in the spot. Jairam, I congratulate you on your rather brilliant introduction of Krishna-Menon, and particularly the dynamics that brought Nehru close to Krishna-Menon. I'm going to take a slightly different angle. How long can one speak?
As long as you want.
Oh, come on.
I'll put a stop to it, don't worry.
I'm going to take a slightly different angle, because what we have today is a total refusal of accepting the past. Now, not that one needs to do, but to start from the premise that all that went on in the past was wrong and we need to correct it. I think that is the sort of approach which I personally feel very uncomfortable with. Now, may I ask all of you just to reflect on what was India's position in 47, 48, spreading up to early 50s. We had the partition, we had the trauma of the post-partition massacres, we had Pakistani raiders occupying parts of Kashmir, and so on and so forth. So, if one throws one's mind back to what could a leader do at that time with all these problems in front of him, I think the best policy was to say, I should have added, it was also the height of the Cold War. I think the best policy was really the sort of policy that Nehru adopted. An idealism that befitted a civilizational country like India, and his hopes that another huge civilizational country, China and India, could, if they became friends, could change all the sort of aspects of what happened in the world that Jairam referred to. The point in all this is idealism, of course, needs to be supported, as we all know, by a sense of realpolitik, and maybe that was absent. But, and I go back because Jairam kept pointing his finger at me. Look at the situation in 1950. By 1950, China had become the People's Republic of China, thanks to the great victory that Mao Zedong had, squashing the then government of China, Republic of China that was called. At the same time, Nehru looked at the way China had come forward, including the opposition that the Chinese, under Mao also, had to face with the Japanese, which occupied most parts of China and were brutal to the Chinese. Now, the point I'm trying to make is, therefore, Nehru had no choice except to say that you want good relations with China. As I said, idealistic it may have been. However, what was a miscalculation was the personality of Mao Zedong. Many years later, when I was ambassador in China, I got hold of the film on Gandhi by Attenborough, and I displayed it with a lot of the Chinese audience. And their first reaction was, how can non-violence be a good policy? How can you, we don't believe in non-violence, especially when we have colonialists and imperialists. Another point of view, but it certainly reflected what was not a warm start to the overtures that Nehru made. And I think it was in 1950, that Mao decided to send the army into Tibet. At that time, the government of India sent a note to China with Nehru's approval that please don't send your army there because this is going to jeopardize the admission of the People's Republic of China to the UN. To which the reply from the Chinese was very rude. It said, India has no business to interfere in China's domestic affairs. The reason I'm recalling this is that it was almost the origin of what would happen in a few years and how the relationship could not have become the sort of, could not have become like what Nehru hoped for. And so on and so forth. So one could go on about, at my age, I would call this anecdotage. But what I would like to add here is that things really became worse and worse between the mid-50s and right up to 1962.
Of course, can I intervene? What I wanted to ask you was, here was a defense minister, the second most powerful man in the cabinet. He comes across and straddles every aspect of foreign policy you can think of. And you had a foreign minister also. Now, it's a strange situation for the foreign service to work under. You know, I mean, on the face of it, there is a conflict of interest, which I don't think was a conflict of interest. Everybody knew Krishna-Menon knows everything to every. I mean, he could speak on anything. But how was the reaction from within the service, within the political system, the political head? How was it received? You know, there was this man who has come, who speaks for Nehru, who speaks as Nehru, and who is there on the world stage. And you are sitting there in the foreign service, and there is a Ministry of External Affairs taking orders from a foreign minister. How did it go?
I am extremely grateful that I had no seat there. I joined the Foreign Service very much later, in 1959. And thank God I wasn't
59,
there.
he was still around.
Yeah, but I'm now talking of a period where, you know, a lot of the things took place, including 1950, which I spoke about earlier. So the point here is that once it became known, my only correction is that I was not a member of the Foreign Service in the sense that you think of, thought I was. But the fact is that it was common knowledge that Nehru relied enormously on Krishna-Menon. And I think one needs to turn the focus on Chinese behavior, which could not have been predicted to the extent that you think it could have been done by these leaders. One of the mistakes that both Nehru and Krishna-Menon made, and I'm sure it's in part in your book, is that there was a belief that the Chinese will not attack India to support their claims on territory. This was a rather fateful mistake. But the reason for that was that the Chinese also, and this happened in 1960, and this brings me to a rather important point. In 1960, the then Premier of China, Zhou Enlai, visited India in great desperation because between the mid-50s that I spoke and 60, it became very obvious that India and China were in a conflictual situation over the territorial question. And there was an enormous exchange of correspondence between the Indian Prime Minister and the Chinese Prime Minister. And therefore, as I said, the Chinese Premier, who was a great diplomat incidentally, decided to come and make an appeal to Nehru. And the point I wish to make is that in 1960, when Zhou Enlai visited India, by then parts of what is called the western sector, that is Ladakh, were already occupied by the Chinese because they managed to build a road from Tibet to China, cutting through parts of what is called the western sector Ladakh, which continues till this day. Now, when it was known that Zhou Enlai will visit India, there was a most enormous opposition to Nehru, where Nehru was really reviled by the then rightist forces in Parliament. I don't want to go into the names of these parties. Really were very, very against this visit. So Nehru had to temporize by saying that the visit is only to talk about talks. And Zhou Enlai visited. There were enormous protests, street protests and other things.
So, could I carry over a question to you?
No, 1960, let me just take this 1960 forward, because it's the critical period
Exactly.
in which the entire relationship between India and China begins to change.
Exactly. I just wanted
59, the Dalai Lama comes to India, and Nehru welcomes him with open arms. And that changes the entire dynamics of the India-China relationship.
That is why I began
We should
with
never
Tibet.
forget what happened to the Dalai Lama.
In fact, that's what you bring out in your book. The fantastic relationship we had with China from the start. And this is a no-holds-barred book, and it's based on evidence. And I really must mention this here. The deteriorating relationship with China is a very, very sad and apparently from what I read from your book, a very avoidable thing. It could have been. Two things happened. I mean, when the Dalai Lama came, even Kissinger writes about it in his book on China. It's well known for us. You yourself have mentioned it. Was it, Zhou Enlai was obviously not very upset with India receiving the Dalai Lama. What they were upset with was this extraordinary reception that he got. There was the Assam rifle standing there giving him, a guard of honor, and then he moves in, the political officer moves in, and it's an extraordinary story by itself. Now, when this happens, the Chinese had never really signed a treaty on Tibet. They had only initialed it. The other part of it was signed. Once a treaty is signed, it finally becomes something which is active. Now, why did this fantastic mistake happen? I mean, your book brings it out to some extent. Could you just dwell on that?
I'll tell you, I think the Dalai Lama is a very important factor in the bilateral relationship. And we tend to gloss over it, but the fact is that the Chinese were convinced that the Dalai Lama's entry into India, flight to India, was a joint CIA-Indian plot. And this is something that was firmly embedded in the Chinese consciousness and the Chinese language towards India. The body language, the language of the written word begins to change after Dalai Lama's flight to India. 1960, Ambassador Ranganathan mentioned Zhou Enlai's last visit to India in April of 1960 to somehow find a agreement on the border. It's a remarkable visit. It's an extraordinary visit. Krishna-Menon is kept out of the talks. Yeah. He's not a member of the delegation because Nehru's number 2 in the cabinet, Govind Vallabh Pant, says that if Krishna-Menon is going to be involved in these talks, count me out. So Swaran Singh, Swaran Singh is known in Indian political history as the man who could speak for hours without saying anything. Swaran Singh was the man who was on Nehru's side when these talks are going on with the Chinese. And then Nehru does an extraordinary thing, which Mr. Modi didn't do to Trump, or no prime minister does to a visiting head of state. Nehru tells Zhou Enlai, go and meet Govind Vallabh Pant. So Zhou Enlai meets Govind Vallabh Pant. He tells Zhou Enlai, go and meet Morarji Desai. Meeting Morarji Desai and listening to all the homilies, he goes and meets Morarji Desai. Then, to top it all, as if that Chow En Lai's cup of misery is not complete, he says, go and meet Dr. Radhakrishnan. So he goes and meets Dr. Radhakrishnan. The point, Uday, if Nehru is interested in a deal, he signs a deal. Now, he's exposing Chow En Lai to Govind Vallabh Pant, to Morarji Desai, to Radhakrishnan, all three of whom who didn't want any agreement with the Chinese. And Nehru is telling Chow En Lai, look what I have to deal with. So do not, think that it's easy on my side. Krishna Menon is nowhere, but he's meeting Chow En Lai. The maximum meetings Chow En Lai has had in 1960 is with Krishna Menon. But it is not part of the official records. It's there in Krishna Menon's archives, which I was able to discover 4 months ago. But it's not part of the Government of India's records. The fact is that from 1958, when the Chinese first, the problems of incursion started, Krishna Menon was the only Indian politician saying that India must negotiate the border with China.
He even had a solution for
He
it.
was the only man. He had a solution. His solution was, let the Chinese keep Aksai Chin, and they should recognize our sovereignty on Chumbi Valley, near Bhutan. This was the famous Lee's swap formula. Krishna Menon was pilloried in Parliament. The media was against him. Parliament was against him. Not only the rightists that Ambassador Ranganathan talked about, but even the leftists were against him. Even the socialists were against a negotiated deal. And most importantly, Uday, after 1958, Nehru is in his period of political and biological decline. He is not able to assert his authority in his cabinet. His cabinet is against any form of negotiation with the Chinese. There's a very interesting footnote to this. The man who opposed Krishna Menon the most vociferously in Parliament was a young 37-year-old member of Parliament from Uttar Pradesh. He had just been elected to Parliament. And he went hammer and tongs at Krishna Menon saying, how can you even talk about negotiating with the Chinese? They are sitting on Bharat Mata's land. How can you negotiate with somebody who is sitting on Bharat Mata's land? Now that same MP becomes Prime Minister in 2003. He becomes Prime Minister in 1998. He goes to Beijing in 2003. And Atal Bihari Vajpayee signs an agreement with his counterpart that the two sides will negotiate the border. Ambassador Ranganathan knows this story very well. That for the last 17 years, we have been negotiating the border. So in many ways, history has vindicated Krishna Menon. Because today, India and China are actually engaged in trying to negotiate a settlement. Now, how long it will take? 17 years already has passed. Now, 17 years in Indian history and Chinese history is a very small period. When President Nixon went to Shanghai and asked Chow En Lai, what do you think of the French Revolution? Chow En Lai said, too soon to tell. So 17 years is a very, very small period in a long civilizational history. But the fact is, let's not forget, 62, we got a bloody nose, we were humiliated. Krishna Menon played a very important role in that humiliation. But the fact is, today India and China are negotiating the border. Nobody supported Krishna Menon in the 50s on this. Nobody. The entire climate in India was, we shouldn't negotiate with the Chinese. But today we are negotiating with the Chinese.
In fact, that brings me to a small issue which I think you should be able to answer. Because this book is also written by a person who has exercised power in government. So I think it's a little different from a normal historian writing a book. What I wanted to ask you was, this relationship with China, now since we are a little focused on China, which was a big deal, we had a long history of developing a good friendship with them, regardless of, Nehru and Krishna-Menon, they stood up for China in London. They sent medical supplies. Mao acknowledges that. You bring it all out in your book.
There's a letter from Mao to Krishna-Menon in
It's a beautiful
1938.
letter. It's a beautiful letter. And
Amazing.
this is a relationship which should have been fostered. A border dispute should not have derailed it. There are two reasons probably why this border dispute became a conflict. One of them is that we could not, Nehru and Krishna-Menon was incapable of communicating to an Indian public, from your book, I'm not saying it. But Nehru, why couldn't they have communicated an issue like that, saying that we have to settle these unresolved issues with our neighbors more reasonably?
See, I'll tell you, unfortunately, the theology in international circles has, and this is largely the contribution of Neville Maxwell, who wrote a book in 1970 called India's China War. And he made India out to be the villain of the piece. The fact is, Ambassador Ranganathan countered that book, and that's why I have mentioned him. Ambassador Ranganathan's book was called Mao's India War. See, we looked upon India and China war as a war of the border. But what was happening in China, we didn't know. And what was happening in China was 30 million people had died because of the Great Famine. Mao was under attack. Mao was under siege by his own colleagues. And remember, the time that the Chinese invaded India, Soviet missiles were placed in Cuba. They were contemporaneous. So the Chinese knew that the Soviets, the only guys who would stand by the Indians if it came to that, the Soviets were busy tangling with the Americans. And that's why the Chinese attack on India takes place on the 20th of October 1962. So, it was a failure of political intelligence on our part to understand that within China, there were political forces that Mao had to contend with. And Mao's way of contending with this was to create a diversion. The war with India was a giant diversion as far as he was concerned. And Krishna-Menon, throughout his life, his interviews, always said, I could not imagine my friend Chow taking a decision to invade India. It must have been Mao. And Ambassador Ranganathan brought this out in the year 2000 very well when he said this is not India's China war, but it is Mao's India war. And Mao's objective was to give Indians a lesson and then withdraw. Otherwise, Uday, how do you explain this fact, which many few Indians know, that the Chinese came to India, occupied Indian towns, Indian cities, most notably Tawang, and by the end of November, vacated every inch of that space. They came in suddenly and they left suddenly. So the objective of that war, as far as Mao was concerned, was to put India and specifically Nehru in his place. And he accomplished that very well.
How did, it's interesting you brought this up. The Cultural Revolution was there. There was a big famine in China, we know that. The diversion that Mao was seeking with India, to my mind, looks a little far-fetched. I'll tell you why. The Chinese gave us a very long rope. And from the 1950s onwards, when this conflict was brewing, there were a number of discussions they had with us, asking us to settle. Chow's last visit, it's there in your book, 1960. Again, at that point of time, he was saying, let's settle. What really upset us
but we didn't want to settle. We didn't want to settle.
Yeah, we didn't want to settle. Now, does that indicate a decision-making failure, or does it indicate a collective failure of a cabinet which didn't understand the threat enough?
No, it reflects super jingoism. It reflects hyper-nationalism, that you don't see the realities. And the cabinet was divided. Nehru was caught between Krishna-Menon and Govind Vallabh Pant. Now, in benefit of hindsight, Nehru should have asserted his authority. But Nehru was not that type of prime minister. He was not an authoritarian prime minister. He was an authoritative prime minister. He was not authoritarian. He didn't tell Govind Vallabh Pant, you better agree to what Krishna Menon was saying. That was not his style. So an opportunity was missed in 1960 because Parliament was against it, the media was against it, Nehru's cabinet was against it, the President of India, at that time he was vice president, then he became president, Dr. Radhakrishnan was against it. Almost all of India was against a negotiated settlement with the border. Today, if you ask most Indians, they will say, let's negotiate the border and be done with it. But in 1962, the environment was very, very different. Very different.
But there was another aspect to that, which probably you haven't touched enough on your book. There was this Pakistan on both sides of us at that time. It was already a member of CENTO. It was already a member of CETO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. It was then a member of CENTO. Ayub Khan, in a wonderful article in Foreign Affairs, he mentions, look, we have 4 alliances going here, and India should take note of it to make use of us. Because he also had a desperate need to get across between 2 parts of Pakistan. Now, Pakistan was obviously the target of Krishna Menon's ire. It was like Ahab for, in Moby Dick.
Krishna Menon hated Pakistan.
No.
He would be welcomed by the right wing today in this country because he was paranoid about Pakistan. And in fact, the roots of his problem with General Timaya was this. Timaya felt that Krishna Menon was obsessed with Pakistan. And he did not understand that India and Pakistan can come to some relationship with each other. Krishna Menon, in today's language, he would be a dove when it comes to China, but a hawk when it comes to Pakistan.
No, Pakistan, exactly. The reason why we continue to be hawks with Pakistan, it's some sort of a psychosis which has been built up here.
That goes back to 1947. Uday.
But it goes back even further. But what I wanted to ask you was, knowing that he was such an enemy of Pakistan, okay, he was a rival of Pakistan, why didn't he realize that it was a horrible thing not to keep the Chinese completely on our side? He made terrible mistakes towards the end. Underestimating the Chinese threat, advising, saying that they're not going to really harm us. There were things like that he was telling Nehru. But at the same time, Pakistan became such an obsession. Why didn't the Indian establishment react to that? Because there were a number of people in India who were getting more and more warm to Pakistan, even within the Nehru cabinet at that time. This conflict was avoidable with Pakistan. There was a possibility that we could have had some kind of a peace. But Krishna Menon probably, it emerges that he stood against this sort of a line of thinking. Why?
Yeah, he was, we have to go back to 47. The partition of India was a partition created by 2 Menons. We think that it is actually Patel and Nehru who partitioned India. Actually, 2 Menons who partitioned India. VP Menon advised Sardar Patel and Krishna Menon advised Nehru. And it's really the VP Menon, Krishna Menon who hated the side of each other and Mountbatten who loved both of them. So it was a triangle of Mountbatten, Menon and Menon. 3 Menons who did the partition of India. Now, Krishna Menon was ideologically convinced that Pakistan was created by the Anglo-Saxon world to get a foothold in South Asia.
Yeah, exactly.
That was the point that Ambassador Ranganathan also had made in his book.
I'll come to you on that. But
It's part of a geopolitical strategy that it was not just an India-Pakistan issue, and CETO, CENTO,
if I may
Pakistan
interrupt
joining
on
all the
this.
military alliances.
Exactly. When you mention in your book, it comes out that he was against Pakistan. There's no doubt about it. But here was a Pakistan which was aligning with the West openly. By 1960, during Nehru's lifetime, Gary Powers had already been shot down over what was the former Soviet Union. There was a clear indication that Pakistan was being propped up by the West, and it was getting too powerful for us to handle militarily in the sense that it could be handled militarily. Timaya was quite wary about it. And there was also this extraordinary relationship between the generals of on both sides. Whatever it is, they were together. They're buddies at some stage.
Well, they were all Sandhurst educated. They were all Paka Sahibs. Ayub Khan and Timaya were together in Sandhurst. And the day Ayub Khan takes over, he stages a coup in 1958. The chemistry between the Indian generals and Krishna Menon begins to change. Krishna Menon begins to look at all Indian generals as potential coup masters.
I was about to come to that. You see, this coup, the coup psychosis is an underlying aspect of your book. I can see it coming through.
It's amazing.
Was it real?
Today we laugh at it, but in the 1950s, people were talking of coups. When Ambassador Ranganathan joined the Foreign Service in 59, there was talk. Timaya is telling Malcolm MacDonald, the British High Commissioner, and it's part of the records. Timaya is telling, when I spoke in Mysore on this book, people got very upset with me because Timaya is a hero in Mysore, but he's also a hero in Bangalore. But the truth is, Timaya was telling the British High Commissioner that my minister wants to stage a coup against Nehru. Can you imagine a serving army chief telling a foreign diplomat that my minister is wanting to stage a coup against Nehru? On the other hand, Krishna is thinking that Timaya is plotting along with his colleagues to stage a coup against him and Nehru because Ayub Khan has taken power in Pakistan. So this talk of coup and counter-coup was very much in the air in the 50s and 60s. And when this was happening, we should have been actually preparing for war with China.
Exactly.
We were not. And the reason why we were not able to prepare is we had a finance minister who believed that any expenditure on defense is an insult to the memory of Mahatma Gandhi. No, actually true. Morarji Desai actually for 4 years stymied every proposal of Krishna Menon to modernize the defense forces. Because he said money for defense is against a country that believes in ahimsa. After the Chinese war, every proposal that Krishna Menon had put and Morarji Desai had rejected was accepted by the same Morarji Desai because the entire situation had changed after the Chinese war. So, the perils, history must be judged, personalities must be judged in the context of their times. You cannot judge political personalities with retrospective hindsight. I mean, these were the objective realities. You had a parliament which didn't want negotiations with China. You had a finance minister who didn't want increased expenditure on defense. You had a prime minister who was in the autumn of his life, who was not able to assert his authority within his own cabinet. You had a temperamental defense minister who spent only 8 months a year in India and 4 months a year in New York. He was not even a full-time defense minister. He was also chairman of our delegation to the UN. So, these were the things that were happening. And what happened in 1962, it really comes as no surprise that we ended up getting a bloody nose in 1962.
In fact, I came a little prepared for this discussion, I must say. The defense expenditure, despite Morarji Desai, was constantly going up. And it is, I'm quoting no less an authority than Subramaniam, our defense strategist. From 1951, 190 crores, to 1961-62, it was 320. You also bring it out in your book. Now, where did this money get deployed? That it didn't quite make an impact on our China border.
No. You see, the key problem was foreign exchange. India's first economic crisis was in 1958, when we just became a bankrupt nation. And that's when foreign exchange rationing starts in India. Many of you are old enough, Surinder, you're certainly old enough to remember whenever we went abroad, we had a thing called P-form. Do you remember P-form? And in your passport, there would be entries of the amount of foreign exchange you would get. This was a consequence of the foreign exchange crisis that we had in 1958. All defense equipment in the 50s and 60s was imported, Uday.
Yes.
All of it was imported.
And
we didn't have foreign exchange for importing defense equipment because naturally Morarji Desai as finance minister had to ration the foreign exchange. Today we can sign $3 billion contract with Donald Trump for the import of for buying helicopters. It was impossible to do in 1960.
But which brings me to another interesting aspect which comes out in your book. The best arms salesman of that time was Mountbatten. You see, there's no doubt about it. He sold us a Dud aircraft carrier, which fortunately we didn't have to fight many battles with that. He sold us fighter planes, he sold us tanks, Now tell me this.
He sold us partition.
He sold us partition at first. Yeah, of course, he sold us that also. But tell me, what was this extraordinary hold the British continued to have on India? Krishna Menon was obviously an Anglophile, and he was very close to the Mountbattens. Was this whole business of governance getting very personalized at that point of time?
No, I mean, both Nehru and Krishna Menon were good Britishers, but they were true Indians. Remember, Gandhi's main message to us, fight British rule, but don't fight Britishers. Hate British rule, but don't necessarily hate Britishers. Maybe Nehru and Krishna Menon took it far too seriously.
They took it there.
And their best friends were British authors, British politicians, British musicians, British journalists, and Mountbatten certainly was very close to Nehru and to Krishna Menon, and he continues to played a very important role till the early 60s. He was lobbying with Krishna Menon for the appointment of a chief of defense staff. With Krishna Menon put his foot down. Finally, the chief of defense staff was appointed 2 months ago. Bipin Rawat was India's first chief of defense staff. But the first proposal for CDS was made by Mountbatten in 1958, and he wanted Timaya. And Krishna Menon just didn't want to hear anything to do with it. So British influence in India in the 50s and early 60s was very strong. After 62, the American influence becomes stronger because we start importing defense equipment from America. And in the 70s, after 69 particularly, and after Bangladesh war, the Soviet influence begins to get very, very close. It's only after 1980, after the second return of Indira Gandhi, that finally we begin to leave British influence, American influence, Soviet influence, and we begin to see real Indian influence in our decision making.
That brings me to this point, Ambassador Ranganath. How were the Soviets, viewing all this at that point of time?
Viewing all what?
This relationship between India, Britain, China, because there was ultimately the Russians themselves went to war with China a little later. But can you just tie it up? Because finally we've ended up being Russia's best arms importer, in a sense.
Well, there are two eras as far as Soviet Union is concerned. One was the Stalin era, and Stalin really had all sorts of reservations about our independence and all the rest of it. And the other was the post-Stalin era, Khrushchev. Khrushchev became a big friend of India. And Khrushchev even agreed to send us the first batch of helicopters. That is when the defense relationship started taking off. And this in turn irritated the Chinese a lot. For instance, there was a slight border tussle in a place called Longju in Arunachal Pradesh between India and Chinese forces. And Khrushchev asked the TASS to issue a statement that at last this conflict is turning into military things, and asked both sides to negotiate. Lo and behold, the Chinese hated this. And by then the Chinese even gave Khrushchev a name, that he was a Soviet revisionist, that he was no longer, or rather, Khrushchev also held a hand out to the USA and made a visit to 1959 to the usual camp where the American president relaxes. That again was severely criticized by the Chinese and became the origins of a very bitter conflict between China and the Soviet Union, which lasted roughly between 1959 right up to the time of Gorbachev in the late 70s. So, and this is what the Americans exploited by the Kissinger-Nixon visit to open up with China, namely the bitter conflict between the Soviet Union and China. What else did you ask?
There's
me?
an interesting story on this, though. What
course.
Kissinger accomplished in 1971,
Yeah.
Krishna Menon almost accomplished in 55. You know, he went to China, spent 8 days, got 4 American airmen released. He goes to America,
Yeah.
talks to Eisenhower, meets John Foster Dulles. But Krishna Menon, being Krishna Menon, spoils, he meets Dulles, who is the US Secretary of State, 6 times in 4 months. And I don't think any Indian or any foreign dignitary has ever met a US Secretary of State 6 times in 4 months. And he almost accomplished the impossible, which is a rapprochement between the US and China
Yeah,
in
except,
55.
except there's one...
Politics was against it.
One caveat. No. The point is Dulles hated the Indian policy of non-alignment.
Yeah.
He
also
thought
hated-
it was the most immoral thing in the world.
He hated
And-
non-alignment and he hated Krishna Menon because Krishna Menon, at the end of his last meeting with Dulles, he was asked, what did you discuss with the US Secretary of State? And Krishna Menon, being Krishna Menon, couldn't resist saying, dull, duller, Dulles.
Yeah, you did say that. It's there in your book. But having said that, we had a huge relationship going with the US also. 2 reasons. One, of course, food. Russians were asked for food. They were asked to supply us with a food aid at a time when they themselves were starving.
But Uday, I must say one thing that, our Krishna Menon, men found him insufferable, but women found him irresistible.
Absolutely.
And no story on Krishna Menon is complete without, he was a terrible charmer. And the India League that he founded for 30 years in England was really a one-man, many-woman army. And you look at all these young girls from the London School of Economics working for Indian independence, all of them subsequently become great writers, singers, economists. They were all part of the Indian freedom movement. And it's interesting when you look back in the 1930s, how much the Indian freedom movement attracted all these young British, usually women, not men, smattering of 1 or 2 men, but actually a lot of British women. So at some place in the book I have said that it is actually British women who made the idea of Indian independence respectable to British families. And ultimately even Churchill had to come around very reluctantly.
One other aspect I have to ask you, we have Indians in Britain. Yeah, I'm keeping 2 minutes. We have Indians in England. England really comes out in very, very good form in your book for one reason, that all these Indians could be there. The French could not have tolerated their colonial servants to be there in France. England comes out rather well in the pre-independence period with all these people there, being chased by Scotland Yard, yet surviving there, giving talks, holding demonstrations for Abyssinia, for Spain, for everything. It's an amazing thing. What sort of a colonial system did we have? Could we have had a non-violent freedom struggle without the British?
Well, I've often thought about this. If we had to be colonized, the Brits.
Yeah,
I think Gandhi's non-violence would not have worked against any other colonizer other than the British. And the Gandhi-Irwin pact, when Gandhi tells Irwin, I have come to meet you, not as a viceroy, but as a good Christian. And that's how the relationship builds up. It's amazing. The idea of a constituent assembly that Krishna Menon canvasses and which becomes a reality in 1946, is actually Harold Laskey's idea. It's actually a British idea. And if you go back in time, the person in the pre-Gandhi becomes the numero uno in Indian political life only in December 1920. And before December 1920, the person who really made India spin around was Annie Besant. I don't know how many of you remember Annie Besant, but there was a time when Annie Besant was the rage of India. and Ambassador Ranganathan's grandfather.
She was the first president of the Congress Party.
More importantly, Ambassador Ranganathan's grandfather was her closest aide, Sir C.P. Ramasamy Iyer. And all upper caste, highly educated Indians looked to Annie Besant for inspiration. And Annie Besant was again an Irishwoman.
Absolutely.
And and through Annie Besant, the idea again, Krishna Menon goes to London, gets educated, comes back. So the question that you raise, I think somebody should write a book on this.
We should, in
Actually,
fact.
how the relationship between the colonizers and the colonized. Krishna Menon was never jailed for any demonstration.
Not at all.
He was never lathi charged in London. He was forever demonstrating. He was forever pamphleteering. He was forever speaking at Hyde Park, Soapbox Corner. Only thing that he had to undergo was detailed psychiatric examination by Scotland Yard reports. And I think the maximum reports on any Indian was in Scotland Yard was on Krishna Menon. And there's one delightful report which says that Krishna Menon is often considered to be a communist, but he is not a communist because he lacks the discipline to be one. This is a Scotland Yard examination of Krishna Menon.
That's a completely different story. Fantastic amount of reports on him.
But
now,
barring Churchill, every other British leader, and even Churchill, for all that, for all his imperialism, Churchill somewhere has been in Bangalore. He has spent, a year and a half in Bangalore. He just hates the Brahmins, that's all. He doesn't hate the Indians, he hates these Brahmins. So there was that caste angle that Churchill brought in. But Krishna Menon succeeded in England largely because of his brilliance, but he couldn't have succeeded in France. He couldn't have succeeded in Germany. He couldn't have succeeded even in the US, I would say. It's only in England that he could succeed. And one of the reasons why he succeeded, in my view, was the influence of the Theosophical Society. We forget the Theosophical Society today, but once upon a time, the Theosophical Society was a very important organization in Indian public life.
Now, obviously, time is running out, and could we take questions from the audience? Yeah, you.
Hello. Hi, sir. So this question is on behalf of my friend who could not be here today. Yeah, this question is on behalf of my friend who could not be here today. So he's asking while going through the archives of Mr. Menon, did you find anything that talks about the Henderson-Brooks Bhagat report?
No. Henderson-Brooks report.
The Henderson-Brooks report is not been declassified. Very few people have actually read the Henderson. For those of you who don't know what the Henderson-Brooks report is, Henderson-Brooks was a British Army officer, was an Indian Army officer who was asked to do a post-mortem of what happened in 1962, and he produced a report that is still kept top secret, and the present government vowed to declassify it when it was in the opposition, but in the last 6 years it's not been declassified. I don't see any reason why it should not be declassified. I know one or two people who have read the report, and the report indicts both the military leadership and the political leadership. So I don't see why, and that's there for everybody to understand. And that's what my book also shows, that it was not only a political failure and a diplomatic failure, but it was also a military failure. All I can say is I hope somebody declassifies the report. Nothing secret about it.
And probably everybody knows its content, yeah.
There used to be
the mic has to come.
I think there was one civil servant who said there are 3 levels of secrecy in India: secret, top secret, and open secret. So Henderson Brooks is an open secret.
Hi.
Could the mic be passed on to?
So, quick question is, you speak in your book about, you talked today about the political side of the Chinese war. There's also the part that you bring to your, in your book about the military side, the pettiness and the backstabbing that was going up in the upper echelons of Indian military at that point of time. And you kind of don't conclude, but you kind of throw light upon how ill-prepared and how incohesive possibly our defense forces were. Now, in the recent times, we've seen also in terms of, like choosing the person for heading the Indian Army or various armed forces, we've seen a similar amount of acrimony and sometimes controversies. So question is, given that you've been a part of the government, do you see things have changed dramatically from those times of pettiness and backstabbiness, and is the Indian Army really cohesive and ready to fight a war?
No, things have changed dramatically. In 65, we had a war. It was an honorable draw. In 71, we won a spectacular victory. Then we've had a lot of small wars. We had a war in 1967 with China, which Ambassador Ranganathan will tell you about. If we had a war with China, we actually won that war with China at Nathula. We had a war, we had a skirmish with China in 1986, and we came out at Sumdrongchu. We came out well. So we have learned the lesson of 62 very well. The most important lesson we learned from 1962 is you shouldn't have a defense minister who is meddling in operational decisions of the military leadership. In 1971, Indira Gandhi and Huxley took the political decisions. The military decisions were taken by Manekshaw and company. In 62, that didn't happen. And I think, we have learned, we have come a long way from there. But in 62, I think in the 60s, as I've given you the example of Timaya, who was speaking against his minister to a foreign diplomat, which is unusual. And you had a number 3 army officer who then became the chief of army in 1962, writing articles for the Statesman, anonymously, called by a military correspondent. Can you imagine a serving general writing about the military matters in a newspaper without official permission? So those things are not happening anymore, you know.
Your question.
Actually, wanted to ask you something else. I haven't read your book, but what about his role in the UN? Was he really regarded as somebody, he used to filibuster a lot. So was he regarded as somebody who knew the policy making, or was he, again, putting off a lot of people with his role in the UN?
In the 1950s, he was known as Formula Menon. And he was known as Formula Menon because wherever there was a crisis, he would be called. So the Korean crisis of 1952, Krishna Menon unraveled that crisis. The Suez Canal crisis of 56, he had an important role to play. The Indochina peace accords. I mean, he brought peace everywhere in the world except on the border with China. I mean, Algeria, South Africa, you name it, and Krishna Menon was involved. Unfortunately, history will judge him poorly because while he was doing all these great formulas for the rest of the world, his formula back home,
Backyard.
he was not able to sell his formula in his own backyard.
Yeah, there's a question there.
He has the record for the longest speech at the UN. He spoke for 8 hours, 4.5 hours one day, and 3.5 hours the next day. Castro holds the record for the single, unbroken, continuous speech, but Krishna Menon spoke for 8 hours on Kashmir, and that is considered to be the finest performance by any speaker at the UN today.
And it was on Kashmir.
It was
On Kashmir, sir.
Mr. Jairam, Ramesh, I haven't read your book, but have you mentioned the snub that Krishna Menon gave to the British representative in the UN when the British representative criticized Menon for his English? Menon shot back and said, I learned English in the university. Unlike you, you learned it on the street. I don't know whether you mentioned that, but
Yes, yes, very much there, Captain, because I found written evidence for it. That's why I've mentioned
Okay,
it.
okay.
Otherwise, I wouldn't have mentioned it.
now
Many stories of Krishna Menon I have not mentioned because there's no proof. There was no written proof. But the one that you just mentioned, it's part of the UN records, so I could
okay.
use it.
have you wondered why all Krishna Menon's friends in the UK were Fabians? There was hardly any conservative, and I don't know whether he ever met Churchill or Eden or anybody. Therefore, I think his, earlier you said, that he was not a communist, but certainly he was a leftist and a Fabian socialist. I think this is a very important factor because later on, when he condemned Britain for its sewage adventure, but forgave Soviet Union for the invasion of Hungary. I think his leanings were very clear. I think you perhaps were very forgiving when you say that he is not communist.
He was a member of the British Labour Party. His links with the Labour Party were very, very deep. His links with the Conservatives was not as deep as it was in the Labour Party. He knew Churchill. There's some correspondence between him and Churchill. His great favorite was Anthony Eden, who became Foreign Secretary. But Anthony Eden had to resign after the Suez Canal crisis. And Krishna Menon had a role in diffusing that crisis. But you're right. His position on the Hungarian crisis gave a reputation that he was actually apologizing for the Soviet Union. But as I've brought out in the book, there's a very important point. The reason why he opposed the American resolution on Hungary at the UN, for which he has been criticized for the last 60 years, is because the American resolution had elections in Hungary under international auspices. And Krishna Menon believed that if he had voted for that, the next step would have been elections in Kashmir under international auspices. And the reason why he voted against the American resolution, for which he has been criticized in India and abroad, is because he didn't want to open the doors for international verification of elections in Kashmir.
What is a little...
Last point. There was an ICS officer by the name A.D. Gowala in Bombay. He was a severe critic of Krishna Menon.
A.D.?
A.D.
Gorwala.
Gorwala. And he used to bring out a weekly called The Opinion. And from the time the Jeep scandal broke out, Gowala was targeting Krishna Menon for his leftist leaning and for his influence on Nehru. I don't know where you brought it out.
Yes, I mean, I'm aware. I've seen the Gorwala correspondence. In fact, Captain Gorwala figures very heavily in Scotland Yard reports because all British intelligence reports on India, on Nehru, came from Gorwala. And Gorwala was a congenital Nehru, he had Nehru phobia and he had Krishna Menon phobia because he saw Reds under the bed when they didn't exist. And Gorwala was an old ICS man. He was then a young ICS man. He was an ICS officer who quit the service and never reconciled himself to the fact that Nehru and Krishna Menon had taken India on a leftward path. It was a tortuous relationship. You're right to an extent that the Jeep scandal, when it broke, it was a scandal. There's no doubt about it. Did Krishna Menon make any money? No. Did Krishna Menon knew who made the money? Yes. Was the money made for private purposes? 50%. 50% of the money went for running hostels, clubs, India League. It went for a public purpose. Now, am I justifying Krishna Menon? No, I'm not. In fact, large chunks of this book are on the Jeep scandal because it was India's first, independent India's first corruption scandal. But no money was made by Krishna Menon. But he certainly knew, you see, honest men can have dishonest friends. He was an honest man. He was a man of great personal integrity. But, he had a knack for picking up friends who were less than desirable. And 2 of them, I think, skimmed off money on the import of jeeps.
Quite a bit of it. We'll take, henceforth, the question will be one, please don't tail, so that we'll give the rest of the audience a voice also. Yeah, please, your question?
Okay. Yeah, my question is, thank you very much for the book. For a younger generation like us, probably it's a good opportunity to know the political leaders of those times. Sorry, I have prepared 2-3 questions, but then I'll try to restrict it to one. One is, we said welcoming Dalai Lama to India spoiled our relationship with China to some extent. We discussed it a little bit. But then I think even today, if such a situation arises, India, for its cultural values, should be welcoming, even at the cost of antagonizing a neighbor. So to that extent, I think what the government and the Nehru and Krishna Menon, etc., has done was the right thing, and we should continue to do, because the historical values of India should supersede the political exigencies which we are currently facing.
Okay, but what's the question?
Question is, why are we ridiculing that position taken by the government at that time?
He's saying, why are we ridiculing the position that we took, that the Dalai Lama came here?
No, I'm not ridiculing it. I'm not ridiculing the position. I'm just saying that the Dalai Lama came to India first in 1956, when we celebrated the 2500th birth anniversary of Buddha. And Chow Enlai also came to India in 1956. And Nehru advised Dalai Lama to make his peace with the Chinese and live with the Chinese. But in 59, the Dalai Lama all of a sudden ups with a large retinue and comes to India. He is given asylum, he is treated as a state guest, and that changes the Chinese view on India. I am fully in support of giving asylum to Dalai Lama. All I am saying is there was a political cost associated with it. And that changed the dynamics of the India-China relationship. In 2 hours of conversation between Krishna Menon and Chow Enlai in April 1960, for 45 minutes, all the Chow Enlai could speak about was Dalai Lama and how Dalai Lama has been set up by the Americans to spoil India-China relations.
Yeah, the gentleman here.
Yeah. Namaste.
Okay, I'll give the lady a chance already.
In Marathi book, I have read that Pandit Nehruji kept the External Affairs Ministry portfolio with him for 17 years after independence. अगर वो नहीं होता तो इतिहास कुछ बदल जाता क्या? Because V.K. Menon was his confidant. दूसरी बात आपसे can we expect some biographies of Sardar Patel, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, Lokmanya Tilak, because these are the forgotten Congress people.
I agree.
Yeah, I wish that, because the new generation doesn't know, they only know Nehru and people after that. Thank you.
क्या पंडित जी को 17 साल विदेश मंत्री रहना चाहिए था? बिल्कुल नहीं. क्या किसी और व्यक्ति को विदेश मंत्री बनना चाहिए था? जरूर. मैं बिल्कुल सहमत हूँ. जब मैं पंडित जी के बारे में लिखता हूँ, ऐसा नहीं कि मैं उसको हीरो बनाता हूँ. उनकी जो खामियां हैं उसको भी दर्शाना चाहिए. हमारे देश में बुरी आदत है, हम लोग हमारे नेताओं को या हीरो बनाते हैं या ज़ीरो बनाते हैं. बीच का रास्ता कोई नहीं है. या हम नेहरू भक्त होते हैं या मोदी भक्त होते हैं. तो भक्त होना, हमारे देश में भक्ति योगों की कोई कमी नहीं है, पर जो ज्ञानी योगी हैं उनकी कमी है. तो इतिहास से ज्ञान लेना चाहिए. और जो हमारे महान नेता हैं, नेहरू, पटेल, अंबेडकर, कोई है, सब जो कुछ उन्होंने किया, सही किया, वो गलत है. सब उन्होंने जो किया, गलत किया, वो भी गलत है.
Yeah, your question.
My comments are really anecdotal, if you don't mind. It is about the defense research and the contribution of Krishna Menon to defense research. I know there is a passage, there are some sections there in the book, but I want to share a little experience. I joined the defense research 3 years after Krishna Menon left defense in 1964. And I joined a laboratory which had been personally created by Krishna Menon, and it was a very unusual laboratory. It was called the Solid State Physics Laboratory. Most unusually placed in the Defense Ministry. Our prototype model in the UK did not have a solid state research laboratory in the defense. So suddenly there was a little incident which I heard about when I joined the lab in 64. There was a cabinet paper pending for consideration for creation of this laboratory in 1961. And it was not coming up. So, and suddenly the defense minister, Krishna Menon, calls the laboratory. He says, the director must come and be sitting in the cabinet anteroom when I am presenting this. And the director was on leave. So the number 2 man, who was a very young person, rushed to South Block and sat in the anteroom. And Krishna Menon came and took him also inside and made a brilliant presentation to the cabinet on microcircuits, integrated circuits, and lasers, and so on, and establish the need for a military lab working on lasers and military technology. It was passed, it was approved and came up. Then the question was, why was it taken up suddenly? And apparently the cabinet secretary was told to move the agenda and push this one. That is because Krishna Menon found the finance minister had gone on tour.
That's a good one. So,
I'm glad you said this because, while on the one side, Krishna Menon is rightly criticized for 1962, he's not given adequate credit for DRDO. He really is the father of DRDO. And Kalam himself is on record. In 2006, DRDO came out with a history of DRDO, and the first chapter was on Krishna Menon. You must have seen this. And the other thing that he did for India, today Mr. Modi is talking of Make in India. The first Make in India was the MiG-21 aircraft. And the MiG-21 came to India because of Krishna Menon. The Britishers were offering us aircraft, the Americans were offering us aircraft, and Krishna Menon chose the Russian aircraft because the Russians were allowing that aircraft to be manufactured in Bangalore. And that was the first decision of MiG-21 in 1963. So defense production and defense research, I think he played a great role. Unfortunately, the other side of his man management, particularly managing the army generals, has obliterated this side of his legacy. But that's a very important side of his legacy.
yeah.
This is regarding the Chinese expansion towards Tibet. In 1949-50, Patel warned Nehru about the threat from China very strongly. He wrote letters also. Was Menon responsible for not considering it at all? Or was it Nehru's...
No, it was another Malayali called K.M. Panikkar. See, there was no shortage of Malayalis in this era. You had, in fact, as I've already mentioned, 2 Malayalis, K.M. Krishna Menon and V.P. Menon. You had a foreign secretary called K.P.S. Menon. And then you had an ambassador in China, Ambassador Ranganathan's very distinguished predecessor, K.M. Panikkar. And then you had a director of the intelligence bureau called T.G. Sanjeevi Pillai. So these were the 5 Menons who were, in fact, there used to be a saying in the 1950s that Indian foreign policy suffered from meningitis because remember that? So you had all this. I mean, I know you are from Kerala. I don't want to wrap this in, but this letter, this famous letter, drafted by Sir Girja Shankar Bajpai and sent by Patel to Nehru, it's a part of historical record. And with the benefit of hindsight, one can say that Patel was right. But the question I ask myself is, was Patel asking India to fight? To send troops to Tibet? Is that what he was asking for? I don't know. We were in no position to send troops to Tibet in 1949. However, the position that we took on Tibet was largely influenced by our ambassador there, K.M. Panikkar, Krishna Menon didn't have much to do with China policy till 54. His role in China policy really is post-Bandung, which takes place in April of 1955.
Yeah.
You mentioned in one of your comments earlier that after the war with China, the British played a decreasing role in Indian foreign affairs, and they were supplanted by the Americans. So this might be slightly off topic, but do you see any similarities with a very similar dynamic seen in many Middle Eastern countries after World War II?
I couldn't. Could you repeat the question, please?
Oh, so you mentioned in one of your comments earlier that after the war with China in 62, the British played a decreasing role in Indian foreign affairs, and they were supplanted by the Americans. So do you see any comparisons with a very similar dynamic, which was seen in most Middle Eastern countries after World War II, where the British were predominantly in charge, but...
Yes, absolutely, you're right. You're right. In 62, actually by 58, American role in India is beginning to increase. Because of the foreign exchange crisis, we are dependent on the Americans. We start importing PL 480 wheat. The American foundations, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, become very active in India. And in 62, after the war, the Americans tell us point blank, if you want military assistance from us, Krishna Menon has to go. So Krishna Menon resigns, and Krishna Menon's resignation is one price that we have to pay for getting American aid. So American defense equipment begins to flow in 1962, but by 69, that begins to wobble because they start playing Pakistan as well. And that's when Indira Gandhi decides to play the Soviet card. And we become closer to the Soviets, and we sign a treaty with the Soviet Union in 1971. Same thing happens in the Middle East. As the British begin to withdraw from the UAE, from the littoral states, the Americans go in. You're absolutely right. I mean, this is what happened in Afghanistan as well. The British had the influence, the British left, the Americans came in. India is the only country in the world, perhaps, where the Americans didn't fill the British vacuum to the extent that they did. And that goes back to what Ambassador Ranganathan said right at the beginning. I think that was India's foreign policy, that we must have an independent, non-aligned policy, which meant that we don't align ourselves with either of the two blocks.
We have time for one last question. Any last question? Yeah. Frantic.
You mentioned, Mr. Ramesh, about
I think we can take one.
about Krishna Menon's attitude to, the approach toward Pakistan. Many people believe that when Nehru went to the United Nations, with the Pakistan attack problem, that probably was influenced by Mountbatten, and there were a lot of doubts about it. Did Krishna Menon play any role in it? Was he aware of it, or did he advise against it? Or did he suggest that we go to the United Nations? Did he play any role at all?
For taking Kashmir to the UN?
Kashmir to the UN.
Well, the idea of taking Kashmir to the UN was Mountbatten's. It was approved by Gandhi. It was reluctantly approved by Patel. And Krishna Menon was not involved in that decision at all. In fact, Krishna Menon protested to Nehru in 1949 that he should not have taken it to the United Nations. And by 55, 56, Nehru has also come around to the point of view that taking it to the UN was a mistake. It shouldn't have been taken to the UN. So, but that decision was largely Mountbatten's decision. It was a time that people thought that the UN is a new organization. India has a strong case. Remember, in 1948, in 47, we took Pakistan to the UN. But at roughly the same time, or little later, the Nizam of Hyderabad took India to the UN. And Hyderabad is still an issue in the UN Security Council. It has not been closed. I mean, it's just there. So he took us to the UN Security Council. So the UN Security Council was there. In retrospect, yeah, absolutely, it was a mistake. Up to 57, we used to get regular UN pressures, but this 8-hour speech of Krishna Menon was, I think, a turning point, because that was the first time India's case on Kashmir was made with great eloquence and great, at length in the UN. So after 57, we have been able to resist UN pressure. It's no longer, it's no longer an issue. I mean, it's an issue in the UN, but the similar agreement, India and Pakistan have agreed that Kashmir is a bilateral dispute. It'll be resolved bilaterally.
It's with a great deal of regret that I must bring this wonderful meeting to a close. We can have another hour going, another 2 hours going perhaps on this. But such a wonderful book. And of course, I've reviewed it. And I know that it's a no-holds-barred book. Neither Nehru nor Krishna Menon is elevated to divine status, nor are they damned. They come out as ordinary and good human beings, but with their own frailties and their, peccadillos. Krishna Menon, we didn't talk enough about Krishna Menon's love life. Perhaps we can do it on another occasion. But to all of you who have made this evening wonderful, a big thanks.
He was a bachelor, but not a brahmachari.
Not at all, not at all, not at all. But, and to Ambassador Ranganathan, a particular thanks for bringing a period back to us of China and the conflict, and to you for expanding on your book so well. Thank you.